Good morning, everyone. My name's Andrea Collins and I'm from the Export Department. If you just bear with me 2 seconds, we're just letting more of you in. Just make sure everybody that's joining can join. So yes, good morning and welcome to our webinar today, which is the second of 3 that we're doing. For the Southwest Growth Hubs. Today we're talking about the border operating model and essentially the Northern Ireland Protocol as well, which as many of you might have experienced so far or might have read about, adds a certain level of complexity to GB traders when dealing with Northern Ireland. Before I continue though, I'm going to invite my colleague Richard Morgan to say a couple of words. He's from the Growth Hub. Are you there, Richard?
Yep, hopefully you can hear me, Andrew.
I can. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Richard Morgan, and I'm part of the EU Exit Support Team at GFirst LEP. We're here to offer free support to Gloucestershire businesses which have been affected by the EU exit. If you're in Swindon and Wiltshire or the west of England, you can get similar support from your local growth hubs and your local LEP. Today, we're delighted to be working with Andrea in the Export Department to talk about the UK's border operating model and how that affects international and Northern Ireland trade. If you've missed our previous webinars on countries of origin, VAT and the services industry, you can find those on our website, which is at www.thegrowthhub.biz/EU exit. Where you'll also find podcasts, frequently asked questions, advice documents, and other resources. As Andrew's already said, there's another webinar coming up next week covering alternative and emerging markets, and that's next Wednesday. At that point, I'll hand over to Andrea now, but if you do have any questions about what free support is available from us, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.
Super, thanks Richard. Okay, so border operating model, wow. This goes back to July last year when it was first announced, and we've had several iterations of it since then. So today I'm just going to talk you through the latest developments. Some of you may have read in the news that there have been delays to border controls and so on. We'll cover some of that as we go through. But then I felt it was really important to touch on Northern Ireland as well. Because some of you that joined last week, I may have touched on this, Northern Ireland has been kind of suspended in this kind of hybrid model somewhere between the UK and the EU, in so much as it's part of the UK customs territory, but it's still part of the single market for the purpose of goods. So it adds a level of complexity, not so much for Northern Ireland businesses trading with GB, but certainly for GB traders moving goods into Northern Ireland, but we'll cover that off as we go through. So just by means of setting an agenda, we're on an open kind of call today. We're not on a traditional webinar where you all have to put your questions in the chat. You can absolutely put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll cover those off at the end. Richard will help me field some of those. But similarly, you're very free to unmute yourself at the end when we do Q&A. Sometimes it's quite nice to be able to hear your voices and see your faces. So please feel free at the end if you've got any burning questions to raise them then. No such thing as a silly question. If I'm answering it for you, then somebody else will be benefiting from the answer as well. But just by means of setting an agenda, so we're just going to have a quick recap of where we're at now in terms of, the transition period has ended. What does that mean for us in a number of different areas? Then we'll talk about the purpose of the border operating model just by means of a brief introduction to that document, which was some almost 200 pages when it was first announced. Fantastic bedtime reading. And then we're going to talk about the kind of, I call it the systems map, and I think it's referred to in the border operating model as the systems map as well. I find it fascinating because I'm quite sad that sorry, just letting somebody in, that when you do an import or an export declaration, the different systems that are triggered and, that play a really important part of sharing that declaration data with different government bodies, and the whole pre-authorization and pre-notification kind of process that goes on. And there's a fantastic process map in the border operating model that explains that, and we'll talk through some of these different systems and databases, because depending on the commodities that you're moving, you may well have to register with some of these databases in order to do that pre-notification and authorization process. And then we'll talk a bit about what the government's done to boost the UK's infrastructure around ports and so on, because as you can imagine, going from, I think there's some figures out there that say something like EU exit causes the UK to move from doing something like 55 million declarations a year to 255 million declarations a year. And certainly HMRC's old system chief, as you may be familiar with, certainly couldn't cope with that level of scale. So that's why CDS, or the Customs Declaration Service, is coming in as well. But we'll talk a little bit about how the government has essentially beefed up the provision at the ports to be able to handle these additional declarations, but also additional checks and so on, depending on the goods that are moving. We'll talk about the definition of goods, because the border operating model talks about standard goods, and then kind of controlled goods are goods requiring additional, having additional requirements placed upon them. So we'll define what those are so you can very clearly see where your goods fit. And then we're going to look at some of the process flows that the border operating model is actually, my hat's off to the government for producing really what's quite a comprehensive document. And the process flows in particular are very good, because they break down the obligations and the activities by importer, exporter, carrier, and so on. So you can see really, to move certain types of commodities, everything that needs to happen. And we'll talk a little bit about import facilitations and special procedures. We haven't really had to think about these with EU trade before, but facilitations and special procedures are all about speeding up the flow of goods, and some of them in particular about suspending import duty and VAT when goods are moved for certain purposes. So we'll cover off some of those, because they become more important in light of our trade with the EU, and also in light of the way that the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement works around those product-specific rules concerning origin. Then we'll take a little bit of a look at export. So we'll do the same kind of thing as we did from import. Obviously, our exporters, as I've said on multiple webinars now, have had to get their heads around these new trading requirements quite fast, because they didn't have the staging in or the phasing in of some of these new measures like importers have had in the UK. Then we'll talk specifically about Northern Ireland, and then we'll finish off with considerations for you as UK traders, whether you be exporters or importers. What are the things that you should be thinking of and should be having in place to make sure that you can continue trading and being successful in light of the new trading conditions that we've got with the EU. Okay, so just by means of introduction, where are we at now? So obviously we've got no single market anymore, we've got no customs union, we've got no free circulation of goods anymore. So essentially when goods are cleared at a UK port, they're free to circulate within the UK customs territory, so Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But if they're then subsequently exported to the EU, then potentially a tariff will become payable on entry into the EU, because we're no longer circulating those goods amongst what were 27 member states. Okay, we've got no longer got access to those EU free trade agreements. So as I said before, as part of the EU, we were party to some 70 plus free trade agreements negotiated globally, which meant that our preferential trading landscape was vast. We've come out of those. So the UK government is kind of playing catch up in terms of negotiating comparable trade agreements. So we've got a number of continuity agreements. or kind of replica agreements, and then we've got a couple of notable free trade agreements. Probably the most celebrated one was Japan, because it is a direct replica of the EU-Japan trade agreement. But we've got one with Singapore, decision in principle from Canada, and so on. And actually, you know, if you're interested, which you absolutely should be, especially if you're exporting and you want to know whether your goods can enter those export markets under preferential duty, then just do a quick search on the government website for UK trade agreements outside of the EU or something like that, and it will list where the government's at in terms of these negotiations and the various different stages that they're at, whether they've been agreed or whether they're in the process of being adopted, and so on. So we've now got the UK customs territory that has replaced the EU customs territory, as I mentioned. Oh, missed out VAT scheme actually. So we have left the EU VAT scheme. Also, the EU VAT directive no longer applies, and that has certainly, I think the LEP and the growth hubs have already done a session on VAT, but that has caused a certain amount of pain for GB exporters, certainly on the B2C side of things, getting their goods to those consumers or those non-VAT registered entities, and accounting for that VAT in those local markets. So no more VAT scheme, no more distance selling threshold, no more EC sales list. We've now obviously got third country rules that apply between ourselves and the EU. And we've got customs formalities and border controls in place, which means that our commercial agreements and the way that we trade with our EU counterparts, so whether our suppliers or our customers, our terms need to be a lot more robust. You know, we've traded very informally with the EU in the past. This needs to change. You know, so companies are waking up to the fact that yes, we need to be talking Incoterms, and they need to be expressly stated in commercial agreements and on commercial invoices. So that's just one of a number of different things that need to be thought about. But certainly we need to be more robust in terms of our agreements with our EU counterparts. Obviously the UK EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement is now in force, and people are starting to live and breathe it for real and navigate product-specific rules concerning origin, understanding whether their goods qualify. And as I said before, the UK government has started to negotiate a number of continuity agreements and free trade agreements, but there is some way to go to replicate what we had as part of the EU, and it could actually take years, really. And yeah, finally, it's been a bumpy start for both sides. Both sides are feeling the pain, arguably a little bit more us at the moment, because we have phased in import controls on goods coming in from the EU, whereas we've had to pretty much step up to the plate immediately for our exports. So we're probably feeling a little bit more pain, but there's no doubt that there's pain on both sides, and that we should be reaching out to our EU neighbours to try and navigate our way through this together, because despite what the UK government said, despite what the Commission said, at the business level, at the business leader level, they're no more prepared than we are. So we've got to try and figure it out amongst ourselves. So just moving on to the border operating model. So in principle, the government said, you know, we had a kind of like perfect storm really last year, didn't we? We had the start of COVID, and then Brexit looming, or EU exit looming. Sorry, I shouldn't really say Brexit. EU exit looming. And the government was trying to think about ways of alleviating the burden on UK businesses. And obviously anybody in international trade knows that import is far more complicated than export. That's unfair actually, because export can be complicated, but import, you get into the realms of you know, dutiable value of goods and all that kind of stuff. So import can be more complicated. So obviously phasing in of import controls was in the government's gift, basically. So it had control over that, whereas we had no control over the obligations imposed upon us by the EU. That's why our exporters had to comply with everything from the 1st of January. But for our importers, there was this phasing in model. Now, there's been some 3 iterations of the border operating model. Now, the first one was announced in July, and we all grabbed it and furiously started reading through it to see what was involved. And then there was another announced in October, and then the final document in December. But those of you that have been following the news now know that there has been a further delay to the imposition of these kind of import controls into GB for goods coming in from the EU. So it may well be that there's a fourth iteration that reflects these new dates. But essentially, the original phased-in approach was going to be, you know, standard goods could delay their declarations, for example, up until June, and then there was another kind of staging in period from April that would require specific obligations placed on goods of sanitary, you know, that have to comply with sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And then from July, it was assumed that the border operating model would be fully up and running and operational. So we'd have border control posts, and goods coming in from the EU that had to be checked would be routed through those. And I think what's happened is essentially we're not ready for that. The UK ports are not ready for that. So the government has made a decision to delay some of these obligations until October this year, and we'll go through some of those timings as we go through the presentation. But essentially the border operating model, like I say, it's a comprehensive document, it's a good document. It lays out all of the different facilitations and custom special procedures that that companies can access. It lays out the different border controls for different commodities. And it lays out standard things that you know, UK traders have to have in place, if you like. It covers off VAT to a certain extent, but what we would always say is, if in any doubt, seek advice from a VAT specialist. VAT can be really quite complicated, and whilst companies like the Export Department and others can cover it off at a high level, you really need a VAT specialist when you're you know, certainly when you're thinking about registering for VAT overseas and stuff like that for export purposes. It talks about safety and security declarations, which is something we've not had to do for the EU, but we'll talk about those as we go through. And then, as I say, it splits goods into standard goods and non-standard goods, or kind of controlled goods. Really important to mention, it doesn't cover really anything to do with Northern Ireland. So there's separate guidance, which I've provided a link for here, that covers that kind of Northern Ireland GB Northern Ireland flow of goods. Okay. So this is the government systems map, and I'm really sad. I really quite like this. So at the high level, you've got what's called kind of like your guidance, your sources of guidance. And here, obviously, you've got the government digital services. You'll need your government ID to register for a number of different applications and so on. But then it's got a couple of pretty good tools actually that the government announced last year. So check how to export goods, and trade with the UK goods. So one aimed at importers, one aimed at exporters. So certainly check how to export goods is quite good for determining the kind of documentation that's required to clear goods going into the EU. It's kind of replicated by the EU, has a database called Access to Markets, which replaces their market access database. Kind of replicates what they do there. So, you know, in the Access to Markets database, you can put your commodity code, the origin of the goods and the destination, and it will come up with everything from the documentation you need to the VAT that's payable to the duties that are payable. But still really quite a good system. And again, trade with the UK can be shared with your EU suppliers if they want to access that kind of data around the documentation that will be required to clear goods at UK borders, and the kind of duties and tariffs that will apply depending on the origin of the goods, for example. So a couple of really good systems there. But then at the permissions level, this is really quite detailed. So there are a number of different databases, if you like, that need to be accessed depending on or you need to be registered on depending on the kind of commodities that you're shipping. So you've got EHCO, which is managed by DEFRA, which is the Export Health Certificates Online. You've got Unicorn, which is again another DEFRA database, which is the database for CITES goods, so those goods that require CITES certification. You've got F-gas and ODS that are both managed by DEFRA, so they're all around if you're moving fluorinated gas or ozone depleting substances, then you need to register with those. You've got VMD, which is the veterinary medicine database. You've got UK REACH, which is the chemicals registration database. You've got a number, other one, so SPIRE you might be familiar with, so that's where you can apply for export licenses for strategic goods or a trade license for certain activities. So there's a number of different databases that you need to be registered on in order to be able to ship goods now to and from the EU. Then this is where it gets really fascinating, I think, so I'm quite sad, is you've got Chief, which is HMRC's current major platform that handles all of the import and export declarations. So that's C88, or the single administrative document that we refer to. Chief manages all of those, and then there's lots of different activities that Chief triggers depending on the commodity code of the goods that are being shipped, and maybe even the the customs procedure code that's been put in. So in terms of notification, you'll maybe, depending on the goods that you're shipping, you may be familiar with IPAFs, which is DEFRA system, stands for the Import of Products, Animal, Food and Feed System. You might be familiar with EDMERO, which is the plant health legislation database. So that's when you're exporting certain plant seeds and organic matter. Peach is another one that you might be familiar with. So you need to be registered on that to be able to do import notifications for plants and plant products on the import side of things. So EDMERO is for export and Peach is for import. If you're moving excise goods, then you might be familiar with the Excise Movement and Control System. So that allows you to suspend, for example, UK excise duty for goods that are going to be exported. So the UK duty is suspended from the goods leaving your premises to the port of exit from the UK, if you like. NCTS, anybody who moves goods under transit will be familiar with that. So the new computerized transit system, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But there are a number of different systems that are triggered by an import or an export declaration. I just think it's really quite fascinating to see them laid out like this. So talking about the infrastructure changes, so obviously we've got these new customs procedures and border controls on those EU goods, and they have an absolutely huge impact on our infrastructure. So the government has effectively delayed the imposition of import controls until October this year. So they've bought themselves some time essentially. So but from October, there are certain infrastructure requirements that are going to need to be met in order for the government to be able to impose full border controls and sanitary and phytosanitary checks and so on, because they need to be done at border control posts, which are kind of parts within ports that have additional capacity and additional expertise to be able to do those kind of checks. So much of the checks will be carried out at the ports, but where the ports just don't have that capacity, then the government has introduced a number of inland facilities that will help support the ports. And the kind of activities that they're going to be doing, obviously I've put some of them down here. So, we're going to need, our ports are going to need to handle an increased number of obviously declarations and so on, but some of them will be handling new types of checks for the first time. So all ports are going to be required to do what we call customs compliance activity, so customs checks and processes that require the kind of physical presence of goods, so those kind of inspections. There's going to be customs transit processes and checks, so those functions that are required under the Common Transit Convention, so where you're starting or ending a transit movement. There'll be market surveillance checks, so there's physical examination and enforcement activity that have to be undertaken on goods. Sanitary and phytosanitary checks obviously will increase significantly, so that's where we're not only doing documentary checks, but we're doing identity and physical checks that are undertaken typically on animals, so live animals or products of animal origin or plants and so on. And then we've got CITES, so where a CITES permit is required, then that needs physical wet stamping, so certain ports will need to be authorised to do that. So this page here, or this slide here, shows the kind of nationwide layout of the ports and those supporting facilities that those different locations will be able to perform. So the ones in red, as it says, are some of them are still awaiting planning permission. The square icon denotes a port that's able to accept goods into temporary storage, and the new pre-lodgement model that'll use the goods vehicle movement service, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So most of the major ports are able to operate those two different models, so the likes of Immingham and Felixstowe, as you'd expect, but then some will operate just the pre-lodgement model, where they don't have the capacity to offer storage, and that'll be the likes of Dover and Portsmouth, Fishguard and so on, that need to have the goods moving through and clearing quickly. Then we'll have the ports that can operate transit electronically using GVMS, like Dover and Holyhead, but then there'll still be some that rely on paper transit, at least initially, so that's the likes of Tilbury and Felixstowe. The government's also acquired 2 inland border facilities to support Eurotunnel and the Port of Dover. So that's Sevington and Dover White Cliffs. The challenge at the moment is going to be for the government to see whether those 2 sites can actually be expanded to conduct full border control checks from October 2021. Because obviously you've got a whole lot of planning and regulatory approvals that needs to happen. So that's kind of in a nutshell where we're beefing up all of our infrastructure, if you like. It's a significant task and requires the acquisition of a number of new skills for certain ports where they've just not had to deal with this complexity before. In terms of additional measures, so the government launched the Port Infrastructure Fund. That was launched in October last year, and it was basically a pot of funding that would allow kind of maritime ports, airports, international rail terminals and so on to beef up their capacity or increase their capacity to enable them to handle goods that were imported from the EU that would need those additional checks. So there was something like 50 plus applications, and all but 10 were awarded, and I think there's been a total spend of about 200 million. The government claims that pot of money is actually part of a larger pot of over 700 million that's going to be invested in borders to ensure that they're fully operational from October, and obviously that 200 plus million has been invested in those inland facilities, which are going to operate in that kind of overflow or support capacity for the ports. There's also been a haulier readiness information and advice site, so that's kind of like a direct outreach and engagement programme with hauliers and haulage managers. So there's been some 40 plus sites set up across the UK from November. And this shows exactly where they're at the moment, and they're really kind of advisory border readiness checks kind of thing, or information on new processes. So they're set up at motorway services, truck stops and so on. So they've been providing multilingual training on new processes. They've been providing hands-on support, like providing Wi-Fi and printers to enable hauliers to be able to collect electronic documents en route. And then it's kind of an ongoing process to make sure that the government's providing the right level of support for hauliers' needs. There's also talk of at some point using these facilities to provide CTC facilities as well, so customs transit facilities if feasible, but that's some way off at the moment. in terms of what are referred to as IBF, so these inland border facilities, so to aid hauliers being able to access this new information, then there's been an app developed, which is the Attend Inland Border Facility. That's what the app's called, and it informs hauliers of a number of sites and what their capacity is, as well as being able for drivers to be able to notify the site when they're going to arrive and so on, and kind of book appointments and so on. So this is the app. That's basically the IBF, if you like, the IBF app. The other one that's been in place since last year is the check-in HGV is ready to cross the border, which was previously referred to as smart freight. So if you can imagine, it's the haulier's responsibility, well, it's the trader's responsibility to make sure that the documentation is there for the goods that they're shipping. But then it's the driver's responsibility to present those goods. And obviously the fear was that if drivers were turning up to the ports with incorrect paperwork, that they'd be turned back at the ports, and that would add to already what was perceived to be the potential for real delays. So there was the process of, or a new system in place that's checking HGV is ready to cross the border. And it's essentially an online form that's completed for every HGV leaving GB at the time of loading the goods, and it captures all of the details that the driver needs. So, you know, it could be just, you know, have you got the packing list? Have you got any transit accompanying documentation, right the way through to specific commodities, like do you have an export health certificate? Do you have a phytosanitary certificate, and so on? So it's a kind of quality control before the goods leave the, you know, say the exporter's premises, through to when they arrive at the port. There's the goods vehicle movement service as well. So that is going to be quite imperative for speeding up the flow of goods. So it's allowing hauliers to link declaration references together. So a haulier moving several different consignments only needs to present one reference at the frontier, which will speed up things significantly. And they should, once they've lodged this, they should get notification of whether or not they can proceed or whether or not they need to file in for checks at the border. And then finally, there's free ports. So some of you that may be familiar with free ports or free zones, they're really a mechanism for growing or encouraging investment. So Dubai, for example, has some 30 free trade zones. There are a number of really successful ones across Europe as well. But the only one that currently exists around us is the Isle of Man. And recently the government, or the back end of last year, the government went out on consultation on free ports with the objective of setting up a free ports policy and establishing up to 10 in the UK. And there were some 350 responses, and certainly some of the ports like Liverpool, Immingham and Gatwick and so on expressed significant interest. And then obviously, if you heard the Chancellor's budget a few weeks back, he announced the first 8 of 10. So the likes of East Midlands have been awarded, Felixstowe and Harwich, Humber, Liverpool City and so on. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland are expected to announce their own free port policies in due course. But personally, I'm a big fan of free ports, so I was quite pleased to see that these are moving forward. So looking at the definition of goods. So as I say, the border operating model splits these goods. So you've got, you know, what we call standard goods, which could be anything from clothing to electronics to machinery, ceramics and so on. Essentially those goods that don't require licensing or certification, or they don't have any special controls over them. So where these are referred to, these are the goods where companies have been able to defer their declarations initially until July, now until I think it's until January next year, actually. So that's kind of standard goods, and they're subject to what's referred to in the border operating model as the core model. But then there's these goods with additional requirements on them as well. So those goods that require CITES permits, those goods with additional customs requirements like excise goods, so tobacco and alcohol. Then you've got those goods that are subject to sanitary and phytosanitary controls, and other goods that fall under what we call strategic exports. So they're kind of like, you know, your wastes, your chemicals, all of these controlled drugs and so on, all of these fit within here. So they're all dealt with differently within the border operating model. Then you've got the border operating model also covers off, it kind of defines what import controls are. So we've spoken, I can't recall whether it was last week, whether we covered this off, but obviously there's different types of import controls. So you can have direct prohibition where you just can't ship product or receive product, but then you have also those that are subject to licensing controls. So you know, controls that are placed against specific goods or imports from specific countries. So the border operating model shows what goods are subject to those kind of licensing controls from, or have been from the 1st of January. Then obviously, like I say, you've got prohibited goods. So, you know, there'll be goods where we just cannot bring them in or ship them unless there's any kind of derogations where those prohibited goods can be imported. But again, anything like that would be listed against the Commodity Code and the tariff. And then sanctions. So the UK has implemented a range of autonomous sanctions from when we left the EU. And they're all regulated under the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act 2018. But we've also essentially grandfathered over sanctions that were in place as part of the EU as well. So you really need to familiarise yourself with the sanctions that are in place against your commodity, if there are any, or similarly whether any licenses are required to ship your goods. So in terms of GB imports, so from January 2021, those companies that had exclusively traded within the EU weren't familiar with imports or exports and those kind of declarations and documentary requirements. And goods, you know, we could ship goods from where I am today in Swindon to, you know, Seville in Spain as easily as I could ship them up the road to Sheffield, for example. That has kind of like all changed, and there are a number of different obligations placed on importers now. So there are a number of different considerations that they need to make. So in terms of declarations, you can, for bringing in goods to the UK, bringing in standard goods, I should say, or non-controlled goods, you can make a full declaration, or you can make a simplified declaration if you're permitted or authorised by HMRC to do that, or you can delay your declaration. So that's where we get into the realms of entry and declarants records. And this is the box that I put here to make sure that anybody that is postponing your declarations, that you're capturing the right data, because it starts, personally, I think it starts to become quite complicated. I'm quite worried now that the government has decided to extend the declaration, the delayed declaration process for what's going to be technically a year. I'm quite concerned that companies are maintaining the right amount of data that will allow them to make that supplementary declaration in January next year. It is a concern. I think also companies have to decide, or have had to decide, whether or not they're going to make their own declarations, you know, whether they're going to do that in-house. Obviously, when we're talking export, there's systems like the National Export System, which is a web-based portal that the government provides, and it's a free-to-use portal for making export declarations. But import declarations are more challenging, so you typically have to use third-party software. You need a badge for chief, and you may need a badge for the different ports that you're importing from, and that can, you know, the cost can start to escalate. So whilst it can be quite tempting to try and cut costs, especially at a time when, you know, costs are starting to rise everywhere we look, I wouldn't necessarily advise it. A good customs intermediary is worth their weight in gold, and can save a lot of time and a lot of cost longer term. So I would weigh up your options really there. To be able to defer or delay your declarations, you obviously have to have a good compliance history. So you have to have evidence of not having you know, bad compliance with regard to tax and customs obligations. So where you're not compliant or you're not solvent, then you won't be able to access the likes of duty deferment accounts and so on, which are required for deferring declarations. In terms of groupage loads, groupage loads are those consignments, kind of mixed consignments, or a number of different consignments are brought together. Now, obviously with customs declarations and different controls placed on product now, that can cause problems with regard to groupage loads. So say, for example, you're shipping goods that are subject to sanitary controls, then it may not be possible to have those in a mixed groupage load with other products that don't have those controls placed upon them now, because the whole process for getting the checks and having everything sealed and so on can just make it complicated for those sanitary and phytosanitary goods to be shipped with non-controlled goods now. Talking about import VAT, so obviously where you're VAT registered, you'll now know that you can use postponed VAT accounting for accounting for import VAT. This is fantastic. It's, you know, it's offered in a number of member states across the EU as well. It certainly helps with cash flow problems. So you don't have to be authorised for it. You just have to sign up to the postponed VAT accounting monthly statements, because that's HMRC's mechanism for telling you what VAT needs to be accounted for in your quarterly VAT return. And you have to use postponed VAT accounting, obviously, if you're deferring your declarations. But then moving on to controlled goods, so they've had to make full declarations from January this year for goods coming in that are of that controlled nature. They're still permitted to use an entry and declarants record, but the time period is shorter. So, you know, typically within 14 days, they'd have to have made their supplementary declaration to HMRC. If you're not VAT registered, I should say, then you've got the ability to use a duty deferment account to defer your VAT. I do have to march on actually, because we're getting quite short of time. This particular flow, so moving on to the import flows for from January, if you imagine this is from January. So this example I've given covers both standard and controlled goods, and in this case it refers to excise goods, and they're coming into a UK port that has customs control processes in place. So it shows a full declaration and also the process for a delayed declaration, and it breaks down, as I said earlier, the activities and obligations by importer, authority and carrier. Okay, so here we talk about kind of like the pre-import steps. So, you know, make preparations to trade. So are you going to do the import declaration yourself? You're going to use a customs intermediary. Are there any approvals that are required? So, you know, are you going to make a simplified declaration, and you need to be authorised to be able to do that? Obviously, you're checking the tariff, so you can determine what duties are paid. If the goods that you're importing are coming from the EU and they're of EU origin, then you should be able to import them without duty. But say they're third country goods that are being imported from the EU, then there's a duty that will apply, and that will be in the UK global tariff. Think about how you're going to account for those duty and VAT. Are you going to use your freight forwarders deferment account, or have you got your own deferment account set up? Are you going to use postponed VAT accounting for the VAT element? Obviously, with the controlled goods, is there any check that you can actually you've got all of the information to make the import declaration? Standard goods, you can defer that declaration, so you can just make that entry in your own commercial records. And then the core import process, so deciding if the goods are subject to suspension, so duty suspension, so you'd need an electronic administrative document to accompany the goods. Controlled goods, make sure that you've, so this is assuming that the goods are going to be stored, that you've made the declaration within 90 days of the goods being presented to customs. So the goods are going into temporary storage here, so you've got 90 days at the port before you have to make the declaration, and that duty becomes payable. Right the way through to the controlled goods, obviously the duty and the VAT is payable immediately, whereas the standard goods, if you're making that deferred declaration, then the duty due on those standard goods will be deferred until what is now January next year. And here you've got, so you receive the standard goods, you make the supplementary declaration within 6 months, or it will be 12 months now, so you would have had to have made it by July. Now it'll be January next year. So you can see here you've got the importer's responsibilities, you've got the carrier's responsibilities, and then you've got what the systems are doing here. So you can see that Chief is quite often positioned as the risk assessment process for HMRC. So it defines which goods are subject to checks and which goods kind of flow quite freely because they're low risk. Then I've chosen here a process flow for import of goods that have specific controls on them, or those additional requirements. And here I've used products of animal origin. So here there are further things that need to be done. So again, we split by exporter. So you've got a number of pre-import steps that the export needs to be doing, the exporter needs to be doing. So they're going to need to get an export health certificate if the import's harmonised. They're going to obviously need to arrange to have their goods inspected before the goods can leave the EU, for example. The goods will arrive in the UK at a point of entry, so there's no border control post at the moment. That is going to be implemented later on in the year. From the importer's perspective, the importer needs to pre-notify of the goods arrival. So they need to make a pre-notification on the IPATHS database, which I mentioned earlier, and that pre-notification issues a number which needs to be communicated to the exporter, and that will go on the export health certificate, so everything kind of tallies that way. Because there's no border control post from January, then the goods are just subjected to those kind of documentary checks which can be done remotely, and then maybe physical and ID checks, but not via those control posts. Those checks can actually be done at the point of destination. And then there's database updates, so AFA updates IPATHS, and then the importer receives the goods. So that's a very, very basic model at the moment. So until October 2021, these goods don't have to go through border control posts. Okay, in terms of what's changing from October, so obviously I mentioned earlier the government's developed that new pre-lodgement model. So that's an alternative for those ports that don't have the capacity to offer that temporary storage. So there's the traditional temporary storage model where goods coming into GB can be stored at the frontier for some 90 days before the declaration's been made and the duty and the VAT becomes payable. But the new pre-lodgement model is where the haulier will have submitted a customs declaration in advance of boarding at the EU side, and it uses the goods vehicle movement service. So there's a lot of processing that's done while the goods are actually being transported, which means by the time that they arrive, the haulier is presenting one single reference, and they'll know whether they can proceed or whether those goods have to be, filed off to be checked, for example. Customs approvals. So from October 2021, any frontier location that receives or dispatches freight from outside the UK will need to be a customs approved area, and then we're not there yet. Border control posts, so they will be implemented now from October 21. So they're those locations that are authorised to carry out those checks on those third country goods to make sure that they don't pose a threat to public health. So those live animals and goods requiring sanitary and phytosanitary. There's a number of ports that have just been authorised to open border control posts. So Humber, I think, has just had 3 new posts authorised where they'll employ something like 40 people in each one of those to carry out those checks. Safety and security declarations on goods coming in from the EU will be mandatory from October. Or actually the timeline slipped slightly. So there are several different timelines or timings that you have to meet depending on how the goods are being transported. So if the goods are coming in from via Eurotunnel, for example, then customs would have to have the safety and security declaration 1 hour before the goods were arriving. Short sea journeys 2 hours before the goods arriving, and so on. So the timing of that safety and security declaration is depending on the means of transport. CCG is quite interesting. So a customs comprehensive guarantee, or a CCG, is where you need to get a guarantee from your bank to cover any outstanding liability on your duty deferment account, for example. And you actually don't need that now for when HMRC is authorised you to use special procedures like inward processing or so on. When you've got a full authorisation, you don't need that CCG. So anybody that's got those full authorisations for inward processing or outward processing, for example, can cancel their CCG unless HMRC is advised that they need it. Where companies are using what we call declaration or authorization by declaration, that's where you're using something like inward processing or outward processing, but you're just doing it no more than 3 times a year. That under those circumstances you'd still need a guarantee from your bank, but this is quite a big one to actually remove it for those full authorizations, because obviously getting a guarantee from your bank can be challenging, especially in today's climate. And the temporary moving on, the temporary storage, so that 90 days at the frontier port, that's obviously permissible now from now moving forward, basically. So those goods can stay at the port for 90 days without the declaration being made and without that duty become payable. And then bulk declarations. So they're really those parcel operators like DHL and so on can make those bulked customs declarations for goods that are no more than £135 in value. And then reusable packaging, we've got obviously it's quite common for companies to import goods and then send the packaging back and then bring the goods back in with packaging. There's the notion of making a declaration by conduct now for reusable packaging, which negates the requirement for a full declaration for those goods that you might be sending back or bringing in empty to send back full, or vice versa. So looking at the import flow from October, this is using the pre-lodgement model. So again, I suppose the differences here are we've got entry summary declarations now. We're showing the obligations on the carrier to make sure that the driver meets the entry requirements. And over here, we're seeing the goods vehicle movement service in full swing. So where the haulier is going to be adding all of the consignments together to get one reference and then updating that with the vehicle details as well. And then, like I say, while the goods are in transit, then the data is processed, and then at the point of entry, the driver knows whether he or she can proceed or whether the goods need to be checked. So that's kind of like a fully fledged import flow from October. And then looking at how that same products of animal origin might change once we've got the border control posts up and running. So you've basically got pretty much everything is the same in terms of pre-notification and pre-authorization. So the importer will have to make a pre-notification on IPAFs. IPAFs processes that pre-notification. Obviously, the exporter is making the export declaration and the importer is making the import declaration. But then here we've got at the border, there's a lot more happening. So we've got goods will have to be routed through a certain point of entry, and that will be a point of entry that has a border control post. And that's where those physical checks will take place. So the Port Health Authority will be doing those physical inspections of those goods and could pull some of those goods for lab tests if necessary. And then the database is updated with the outcome of those checks, and goods are either authorised to proceed or they can be stopped and not allowed to proceed, essentially. So you can see basically a lot more is happening. We've got the entry notifications, the safety and security declarations, and then we've got a lot more activity when the goods enter the port. I just wanted to touch briefly on facilitations and simplifications. So we've got a number of them that apply to imports. So we've got transit. So that's where processes are taken away from the ports, essentially. So you can have different points of destination and origin that can initiate transit processes, if you like. And transit is essentially where goods can move through several different countries and not be cleared until they've reached their country of destination, if you like. There's also customs warehousing, so that's a storage facility, so goods can come into the UK and have their duty and VAT suspended while they're stored in that facility. Inward processing allows the duty and VAT to be suspended if those goods are coming in for repair or for manufacturing purposes, so for further processing. Outward processing, if goods are leaving the UK to go out to be repaired or further processed, for example, they can come back into the UK, and there are reliefs on the duty and VAT that are payable when they come back in. The simplified declaration procedure we know about for imports, so that's where we're making a smaller declaration to be followed up by a supplementary declaration, or we're using entry and declarants record where we're filing data in our own commercial records and following up with a supplementary declaration at a later stage. We've also got authorised economic operator status. That's kind of like an accreditation. It's like a kite mark, a trusted trader scheme, if you like. Globally, there are a number of them, and the UK has its own called AEO. It does have a number of benefits and advantages around getting authorisations for special procedures, waivers on bank guarantees and so on. We know that we've got duty deferment accounts now. We've had them for some time, but they're easier to obtain now. We've got the notion of a duty deferment account with a 10k waiver where you don't need a bank guarantee. Temporary storage we've talked about, and bulk declarations we've talked about. So there's a lot of different easements and simplifications available. I am flying through some of this because I'm really conscious of time. Essentially, GB exports, so we've had to get our heads around these pretty quickly. We haven't had that phasing in of imports on the EU side. So there are a number of facilitations. We've got transit. Again, we've got simplified procedures. We can use what I referred to earlier, the National Export System, that web-based portal. So it negates the requirement for you to bring on a customs intermediary or similarly to buy expensive third-party software. You've got customs supervised exports, which is around kind of excise goods and so on, where your business premises can be authorised to clear goods inland before they've been, before they actually move to the port of exit. And then we know we've got simplified export declaration process. You've still got that EIDR process in place, but that needs to be followed up quite quickly, usually within 14 days by a supplementary declaration. Just quickly on the export flow, so this time you're the exporter, so you've got to make those preparations. So you do the declaration yourself. Are there any approvals that you need for making those simplified declarations, for example? Check the consignment information to complete the export declaration. So, what's the commodity code, CPC code, Incoterms, and so on. Make sure that you've got the exit summary declaration. So the exit summary declaration is typically part of the export declaration, to be honest. Make sure that your importer can receive the goods. Here we're talking about excise goods as well. So if there's any duty suspension, then how do you go about filing that on the EMCS? Make a declaration on NES or Chief. Make sure that the exit declaration's done so far. And yeah, it takes you all the way through. I suppose that the salient points to mention here is obviously all of our exports now are zero rated, whether they're going to trade customers or consumers. And you will need to keep that proof of export. So you typically receive the notification that the goods have departed, and you need to maintain that proof of export for 6 years, because where you've zero rated the VAT, if you don't have that proof of export and HMRC was to audit you, you could be liable for the VAT that you've zero rated. So that's really important. Okay, export flow, we've zhuzhed it up a little bit here. This time we're talking about animals for live aquatic animals. Essentially from, well, we've saying from July here, but pretty much immediately for goods that have goods need to be accompanied by an export health certificate. There needs to be an EU import pre-notification, which will be via the competent authority in that member state. Entry into the EU has to be via a border control post, and export health certificates for exporters here in the UK are issued and certified by the Fish Health Inspectorate. So in terms of systems that are required, obviously, sorry, moving forward, in terms of systems that are required, then the EU importer needs to register for traces, which was what we used until we left the EU. And then the location of checks will be via a border control post in the EU. So you'll have to know where your goods are going, or your haulier will have to know where your goods are going if they're subject to those checks. Okay, so that's kind of like an export flow, just flying through it. And then I wanted to talk about Northern Ireland. So the original agreement from the 1st of January was that goods would go through a point of entry. All agri-food goods and plants and animals entering Northern Ireland from GB were going to have to go through a point of entry that the EU had authorised. So, you know, a point of entry that's approved by the EU. So that would have been Belfast Port, Belfast International Airport, and so on. And then those goods would be subject to sanitary and phytosanitary checks. So they'd have a documentary check. So that was an electronic check to confirm that the goods in the consignment had the right commercial documentation, for example. But then they'd be subject to identity checks as well. So prior to departure from GB, DERA authorised, so DERA's Ireland's or Northern Ireland's equivalent of DEFRA, their authorised staff would carry out identity checks on the commercial seal applied to the consignment. And then there'd be physical checks as well at the point of entry. But there was a subsequent easement, which meant that there would be no sanitary or phytosanitary checks until the 31st of March. And then they would be introduced slowly after that point. Now, what's kicked off recently is a huge row between the UK and the EU, because the UK has unilaterally extended the timeline for these import controls, if you like, going into Ireland. So these import controls, the UK says, won't start until October now, and they'll be introduced in a phased approach. So you'll have phase 1, it'll be the introduction of export health certificates for fresh meat products, phase 2, export health certificates for dairy products, as well as certificates for plant seeds and wine, and then phase 3, phytosanitary certificates for fruit and vegetables, as well as export health certificates for pet food. And then phase 4, the final phase, will see all remaining certification. So the EU is not happy about that, but the UK just believes that the controls at the moment, and not necessarily being fully ready for them, is placing huge burden on GB traders and also impacting the flow of goods going into Northern Ireland, which isn't acceptable. So we await the outcome of that, but it is a contentious issue. In terms of moving goods between GB and Northern Ireland, so if you're moving goods between Northern Ireland and any non-EU country, including GB, that requires another EORI number. So we've got the notion of EU EORI numbers, GB EORI numbers, and now we've got an XI EORI number. For the flow of Northern Ireland to GB, that Northern Ireland to GB flow of goods, most goods won't require a declaration. There could be some exceptions, you know, where goods are stored temporarily, or they're restricted goods, or maybe if there's been a special procedure used, for example. Goods that will definitely need a declaration when moving from Northern Ireland to GB would be controlled goods, or goods that you pay duty on, like alcohol and tobacco, or goods that you're moving under common transit. Now, the Trader Support Service that some of you might be aware of, and certainly should have signed up to by now, was introduced really for companies that have to make declarations for the flow of goods between Northern Ireland and GB. So sign up. There is a ton of training on that portal. They offer support and guidance, and they complete declarations on traders' behalf. For the flow of Northern Ireland to EU goods, there's no declarations required to ship to the EU, because they're still technically, Northern Ireland's in the single market for the purpose of goods. So there is an Intrastat requirement. So if you're over the threshold for Intrastat and you need to make Intrastat filings, so if you're over 250k for dispatches and 1.5 million for imports, then you need to file Intrastat for goods moving between Northern Ireland and the EU. For GB to Northern Ireland goods aren't declared on exit from GB, but they're declared on entry into Northern Ireland. So there needs to be an entry summary declaration, so for those safety and security purposes, before the goods arrive, and then the goods need to be declared where they arrive, either using a full or a simplified declaration if authorised. GB traders really need to consider Incoterms that they're using, and whether or not they're going to be required to make that those declarations in Northern Ireland on behalf of their customers. So that the shipping terms that you're using are really important. With regard to VAT, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, EU VAT rules continue to apply in Northern Ireland in respect of goods. So this really means that apart from changes relating to the EORI number, so using Excise, for example, there's no real changes in transactions in goods between Northern Ireland and the EU. So that means that VAT registered businesses trading in Northern Ireland can still have their goods subject to intra-community supply. So not an import or an export, and VAT's accounted for differently. So it's not import VAT, it's VAT on an acquisition, for example. So HMRC need to know, you know, the kind, if you're bringing goods in from the EU, so they know that you're accounting for them in that way. There are a number of, if you think about it, the Northern Ireland Protocol keeps Northern Ireland closely aligned with the EU for regulatory purposes. So regulations around placing manufactured goods on the market and so on is something that can be an issue if you're, say, for example, a GB trader who is placing goods on the GB market and on the Northern Ireland market and on the EU market. And I suppose the one I would reference here, because it comes up a lot in clients that we're supporting, is the CE mark. So I feel like I've been talking about CE and UK CA mark for years, but the UK CA mark is the conformity assessment mark that the UK has introduced for those goods that used to require the CE mark. So a UK CA mark is needed to place those goods on the GB marketplace, but it's different for when those goods are being placed on the EU marketplace or the Northern Ireland marketplace. So a CE mark is still required to place goods on the European marketplace. So some goods that are supplied in the UK, or in GB rather, and in the EU, are going to have to be dual marked with the UK CA mark and the CE mark. And then there's different requirement for Northern Ireland. So if a GB trader is using a UK body to carry out any, you know, conformity assessment on goods that are going onto the Northern Ireland marketplace, then the company would have to apply for what's called a UK-NI mark as well, and that UK-NI mark can't be used on its own. It has to accompany the CE mark. So you could have a situation where you've got UK-CA and then you've got CE UK-NI on there as well. But I mean, we've been referring clients very successfully to BSI for advice on the UK-CA mark and CE mark, because they've got a foot in both camps. They're obviously a UK company, but they have a legal entity in the Netherlands, so they're brilliantly placed to advise on the different markings for each market. Looking at goods requiring additional or having additional requirements placed on them, so those sanitary and phytosanitary measures, obviously companies moving live animals are going to need an export health certificate or to go through a border control post if they're exporting live animals from GB to the EU, if they're moving live animals from GB to NI, and if they're transiting through the EU and NI. And similarly, composite foods are the same, so moving from GB to the EU, they'll need to have any export health certificate and go through a border control post, and the same moving from GB to Northern Ireland, and the same going from via transit from the EU to the NI. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. With regard to tariffs, I just really wanted to touch on that. So the Northern Ireland Protocol dictates that you know, goods that are within the UK customs territory will not pay tariffs, but there is this notion of at-risk goods, and that's where those goods that enter Northern Ireland are at risk of entering Ireland and therefore may be subject to duty. And obviously we don't want that border on the island of Ireland, so any duty that becomes payable is payable at Northern Ireland. So it's all in line with those declarations that are made. So if the goods that you're bringing into Northern Ireland, if the duty that would be payable on those goods in the EU is greater than 0%, because, you know, goods going from GB to Northern Ireland in the same customs territory, so wouldn't pay any duty at all. If if the EU duty is actually over 0%, then those goods are automatically at risk, and that EU duty should be payable at the Northern Ireland port, if you like, unless you can declare those goods as being not at risk. So you can register on the UK Trader Scheme and declare those goods as not being at risk. And then also, it could be that the goods are subject to preference under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement anyway, so that EU duty wouldn't become payable. But there's essentially that notion of at-risk goods, and it means that if you're not able to declare that they're going to, absolutely categorically stay in Northern Ireland, then there could be a situation whereby there's duty applied. Obviously, the Trader Support Service is a really important resource. And then the other one I wanted to mention is the Movement Assistance Scheme. So where there's requirements for moving live animals or products of animal origin or plants and plant products and so on, you do not have to pay to have your export health certificates raised or your phytosanitary certificates raised if you register for the Movement Assistance Scheme. So you don't pay to have those goods inspected or certified. The official vet or the environmental health officer, the certifier or whoever, doesn't charge you for inspecting and certifying. They invoice the government instead. So you must register with the Movement Assistance Scheme if your goods are subject to phytosanitary or sanitary checks and controls going into Northern Ireland. Okay, so it's just one method of reducing a little bit of cost. And then finally, just some considerations. I apologise, I've taken up a lot of your time this morning. Things that you need to be thinking about is your EORI numbers. So you'll have your GB EORI number, but do you need an EU EORI number? Do you import from the EU under Ex Works? Hopefully not, but if you do, you'd need an EU EORI number. Or do you export to the EU under Deliver Duty Paid, in which case you'd need an EU EORI number there as well. Do you have a requirement to declare goods going into Northern Ireland? So make those entry summary declarations or make those declarations, in which case you'd need an XI EORI number. Think about the classification of your goods. Are the commodity codes correct? Commodity codes are so important. They dictate the duty and taxes, but they dictate any certification or licensing requirements that they may have. Take a look at your commercial agreements, specifically around territory that they cover, jurisdiction that they cover, Incoterms, are they in there as well? As I said at the very beginning, we need to be a lot more robust. Incoterms really important because they dictate the kind of costs and risks and so on associated with shipments. Anything like Ex Works and DDP at the far extremes of the Incoterm spectrum place enormous burden on either the buyer or the seller. Import and export preparations. Are there any databases that you need to register with for your goods, where you need to make those pre-notifications or have those pre-authorizations before goods can be imported? Documentary requirements. Do you know what documentation needs to accompany your goods? And going back to the beginning, those databases like the Export Market Database and also the EU's Access to Market Database are a great source of highlighting the generic documentation that you'll need, but also specific documentation based on the commodity that you're moving. Can you benefit from any import or export facilitations and simplifications? So those things like inward processing and customs warehousing that I mentioned, but also on the export side of things, is there any benefit in using delayed declarations or entry in declarant's record? I think probably not, because you're only really getting 14 days easement in that respect. Think about your compliance history. So when you're applying for things like duty deferment accounts and using postponed VAT accounting, your compliance history might impact you there. And certainly when applying for a duty deferment account, HMRC might be a little bit more robust in terms of asking you for more financial data than they might ask of other companies. Tariff rate quotas. So just be aware that when you're using delayed declarations, you can still obviously use quotas, but quotas are typically on a first come first serve basis. So if you're delaying the declaration, the quota reference would be applied to the declaration when it's made, and it could be that the quota is exhausted by the time you make that declaration. Get your head around customs valuation. So when we're bringing in goods from the EU, they're subjected to the same customs valuation that goods are brought into the UK from the rest of the world. So it's the cost of the goods plus the insurance and the freight to get the goods into the UK, that helps you come up with a dutiable value, and that's what HMRC will base your duty on. And then VAT, import VAT, is based on that whole sum, so it's kind of a cumulative. You've got cost, insurance, freight, duty, and then VAT is applied on all of it. Think about whether or not you need a duty deferment account. If you're not attracting duty on the goods that you're bringing in, my guess is probably not. You could get away with just using postponed VAT accounting, which seems simpler. Think about return goods relief. So previously, if goods have been returned to you in the UK for repair or whatever, there wouldn't have been any duty or anything payable on those. That changes now, but returns good relief will allow you to reclaim any duty and VAT that's payable on those goods. Think about groupage loads, whether you can still ship your goods in groupage, because if you can't, then the cost of transport go up quite substantially. We have a client who had to book a 20-foot trailer for 9 pallets of frozen pork recently, which was a huge cost, but that's because those goods are subject to sanitary controls and they can't ship them with other goods that aren't subject to those controls. Think about Intrastat, if it still applies to you. So if you are over that 1.5 million threshold for goods coming into the UK, then you still need to file Intrastat for this year, but not from the beginning of next year. And obviously, as I mentioned, for Northern Ireland, that will continue. Those Intrastat filings will continue for as long as the Northern Ireland Protocol is operational. Think about rules of origin. So on the export side of things, are you familiar with the product specific rule that applies to your commodity? Can you demonstrate that you've got your bill of materials, that you are that you are classifying your origin correctly? Are you making the statement on origin correctly on the commercial invoice? Otherwise, your importer will have to pay duty at the other end, and that's really important. We've had clients that have continued to put origin UK, and because it doesn't have the exact statement on origin as in the trading cooperation agreement, their customers have had to pay duty. So make sure you understand that you're determining the origin correctly, that you can prove it if asked, and that you're making that statement on origin correctly. Where there is the potential to make a retrospective claim for preference. So on imports, if you have had to pay import duty, but then you can retrospectively prove that you shouldn't have to, then there's a process for reclaiming that preference. And then please think about the proof of export as well. So we've not had to do that for EU shipments up until now, but where you're zero rating VAT on those goods going to consumers or trade customers, then you have to be proving to HMRC that those goods physically left the UK. Otherwise, they can come after you for the VAT that you've zero rated. Then I have given 3 slides here with just additional sources of information covering things that we've spoken about today. And yes, that's it from me. I do apologise. I've gone well over time. And as I always say, it's time you'll never get back. So I do apologise. But my details are here. If anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to fire me a quick email. As Richard said, next week is all about alternative markets, which is so exciting because we get to talk about export and expanding overseas and everything, which is a little bit of a kind of more upbeat way of finishing our webinar series. But Richard, if you're there, if you have any questions, or if anybody wants to unmute themselves, and again, I do apologise everyone for going so far over time.
Andrew, no, thanks ever so much. I don't think anyone cares that you overran, Andrew. It's such a comprehensive and detailed presentation, and we all got so much value from it. So thank you ever so much. I do have a number of questions that's come in over email.
Okay.
The first one, Andrew, it's an easy one, but it's about the border operating model document itself. I think some people have been confused that it's an abstract concept, whereas in reality, the border operating model is literally a 200-odd page PDF that you can look at. Did you just want to expand on that and where people can find this border operating model?
The best thing to do, I don't have the exact URL, although actually I think I have given the URL. Yes, there we go. So the URL is actually in the slides, which I'll get to the Growth Hub today. So when they send those out, that will take you to the latest version, which is December's. And like I say, there may be a subsequent version announced with the new timelines.
Fantastic.
No worries.
Andrew, you got a lot of people quite excited about when you started talking about the previous smart freight, which is this concept that you can get some heavy goods vehicles checked before they leave the office or the factory or the warehouse or whatever it be.
Yeah.
A number of people emailed me saying, tell us more, how expensive is it, how can we sign up? Is there anything you can expand on that?
I can't. It's not something that I've had to look into for any clients yet, to be honest. I can't imagine it being a signed up for or a payable service, to be honest. It's certainly a web-based portal that the haulier or the driver will access at the point of origin, if you like, so where the goods are being collected from, and it's almost going to be mandatory for them to do it, otherwise they risk getting to the port and being turned away if they don't have the right documentation. So I can't see it being chargeable, but I do see it being mandatory over time to try and alleviate the pressure on the ports. I would say Google it to find out more. I'll certainly do a little bit of digging. I've not had to look into it for clients yet. I'm pleased to see that people are excited about it, though. It's just a kind of quality control measure that I can't see why we haven't been doing before.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Just a couple of questions on commodity codes, our old friend. So one question's come in and basically said that there's no commodity specific code set up for my products. What should I do? And then a second question's come up saying that we've done quite a lot of work investigation on commodity codes. There is not one that specifically fits our product, but everything that's close, it has exactly the same duties and same VAT. So there's no difference if in which commodity code they should use. And they're basically asking the question, does it when duties are the same and VAT is the same, does it really matter what commodity code that they actually use?
So if I answer the first one first, so depending on whether there's a couple of things you can do. You can, where you're unsure about your commodity code, whether it be on import or export, you can contact HMRC using their tariff classification service, which is you send them an email with a full description of the goods, any imagery that you've got, and you tell them what the commodity code is that you think applies. They will typically respond within 5 days, although it's taking them longer at the moment, and they'll come back and say, based on your description, the commodity code we think is correct. Based on your description, actually, we think you should be using this. Now, there'll always be a disclaimer that says this isn't a legally or an official instruction, but because it's an email service, you can print it off, file it in with your commercial records, and if you're audited in the future, you can demonstrate that you've done a level of due diligence. So that's the easy way to do it. For goods that you're placing on the EU marketplace, you can apply for a binding tariff information, a BTI, which is the belts and braces approach. You'll typically have to provide all the information I've just talked about, but then samples also, and then you're given your own commodity code, which is legally viable for 3 years and can be extended. For goods going on the UK marketplace, we don't use the BTI system anymore. We have to apply to HMRC for what's called an advanced tariff ruling, or an ATAR. But it's the same process, all of that information, samples outside of COVID, they're not accepting samples at the moment, and they will do the same. They'll give you a commodity code that can be used for imports into the UK for 3 years and can be extended. On the latter part, where you're compliant from a duty and VAT perspective, it's less problematic, but you have to remember that the goods, specifically on import, HMRC is capturing statistical data on those, and that statistical data is important, and as importers we have a legal responsibility to make sure that our import declarations are accurate for that purpose, as well as import duty and VAT. I would say you're not going to get as hard a rap on the knuckles if you're going to be audited, but I think it would be better to show that you've done a level of due diligence. So I would, at the very least, email HMRC using their tariff classification service and ask for some extra guidance.
That's fantastic, Andrew. Thanks very much. I'm going to be really unfair and ask one last question, which is really asking for your opinion more than anything else. And basically, the question reads something along the lines of checks on imports have been delayed until the end of the year. Do you envisage that this could be delayed again and again and again?
I would say that if we can't get our act together by the end of the year, then there's really no hope for us, to be honest. With the level of investment that the government is putting into port infrastructure and skills and all the rest of it, I would be really shocked. And actually, I would be more dismayed, because I think we're delaying it. And certainly when we're allowing companies to further delay their declarations, we run the risk, if they're not capturing the right data now on imports, that problem gets just replicated and replicated each month, and come making those supplementary declarations in January, they're going to be in a whole world of pain, and then they run the risk of, you know, not declaring the right amount of duty and VAT and so on. So I would say that government has an obligation to get it sorted by the end of this year.
That's great, Andrea. Last thing I'll say is I'll just echo. A number of people have said thank you again for the presentation. It's been absolutely fantastic. So again, I echo that. And
thank you.
Yeah, thanks again.
It's a huge subject to try and fit into an hour. So I do apologise I took up so much of your time. If anybody's got any questions, always happy to get an email on those. That's not a problem. Any more questions, or are we done? No. So I think I will get a copy of the slides to the Growth Hub, and obviously we've recorded today's session as well, so you'll be able to access the recording. And like I say, if there's any questions moving forward, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. But thank you, and thanks for co-hosting, Richard. It's much appreciated.
Welcome. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks again.
No worries. Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.